Hi everybody and welcome to this BABCP workshop. I'm Rachel Calum and I'm very happy to present jointly with my colleague Dennis Ugrin. And we're going to be talking about protecting the mental health of children, young people and families living through armed conflict and displacement and how we can help. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Dennis, who's going to lead for the first half of this webinar, and then I'm going to be speaking after Dennis. I'm going to be keeping track of any questions, so do put those into the chat if there's anything that you're wanting to ask about. And at the end of Dennis's presentation, then we'll be able to pick up any questions that you have, and then he'll do the same for me through the second half of the presentation, and then we'll have a few minutes maybe for more general discussion at the end. Okay, so over to you, Dennis.
Thanks, Rachel, and welcome everybody. I'm Dennis Ugrin. I'm a professor of child psychiatry from Queen Mary, University of London, and also a consultant psychiatrist in the community working in East London Foundation Trust, or ELFT. I'm also Ukrainian, so most of my talk will be about Ukraine. This is Marc Chagall. This piece of art is called The Ukrainian Family, and he drew it in 1942 during the Second World War. But I have to say, those of you who saw the pictures from Dnipro just a few days ago with totally destroyed section of a multi-story building in flames, you know, that portrait could have been drawn literally 2 days ago. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Ukraine in general, and then we'll move on slightly towards the impact of the war on Ukraine in general, but also on children. And then at the end, we will think a little bit about what could be done with young people who came to the UK from Ukraine. So Ukraine, you can see, is a fairly large place. Unfortunately, a lot of people now know all of these names, which hardly anybody knew, names of our major cities before the war, and really for awful reasons, because some of these cities are pretty much totally destroyed. For example, Mariupol is one of the cities that essentially has no buildings, untouched by the war, and there are many more now, Bakhmut, Soledar, many others. And there will be, unfortunately, many more in the months to come that essentially will cease to exist. When we think about the mental health of Ukrainians, then there were several studies looking at that question. This is perhaps the largest one with nearly 5,000 respondents, all adults, unfortunately, so no kids there. But really, the prevalence of disorders found in the Ukrainian population before the war was pretty similar to what you would expect in any European country. Perhaps about a third of the population experienced at least one DSM disorder in their lifetime. Remember, this is 2005, so things probably got significantly worse closer to the war. Some differences there too. So unlike the UK or Western countries, the most common diagnosis in men was actually alcohol disorder. So about a quarter of the population was affected, followed by mood disorders. In women, like in the UK, it's actually mood disorders #1, followed by anxiety disorders #2. We don't have really any systematic data on the mental health of Ukrainian children, except for the last in the last few months there were a few studies looking at refugees, but you know, that's a very different population from the pre-war population. Anecdotally speaking, I would say that Ukrainian kids are fairly similar to what you would expect in the UK in terms of prevalence. they are perhaps slightly healthier physically. So, for example, the prevalence of overweight and obese children in Ukraine was about 10% versus about 30% in the UK. But other than that, I think they seem to be fairly similar to what you would expect in the West. Now, one thing that's worth thinking about is that Ukraine had a relatively high suicide rate before COVID, certainly. So this map is the world just before COVID started in 2019. And you can see here that different countries have different trends. So the darker sort of this aquamarine color, then the more there is a tendency towards a reduction in suicide rate. Whereas the darker the yellow, sort of the dark brown colors indicate areas and countries where there was an increase in suicide rates, so the trend towards an increase. And you can see that Ukraine here in 2019 was showing really a trend towards a special increase in suicide. The sort of suicide rate you would expect in Ukraine would be somewhere around 22, 23, 25 per 100,000, which is about double, more than double what you would expect in the UK and worldwide. The reason for this sort of tended towards an increase was that some of you might know this invasion of Ukraine is not the only one. In the 21st century, there was a fairly large invasion in 2014 and 15 and 16 to some extent, when Russia occupied Crimea and then the east of Ukraine too. And many of you will know that during wartime, typically suicide rate goes down. So in fact, in the UK, some of the lowest suicide rates are recorded were during both world wars. However, what happens after any war is typically suicide rates go up very substantially. One could very confidently predict that once the hostilities in Ukraine are over, we will see a very substantial increase in suicide in the population. Interestingly, not just explained by the soldiers coming back with all kinds of psychological difficulties and substance misuse, but also seen in the population in general. So something to be aware of. The other thing about Ukraine and Eastern Europe in general is that there was a fairly atypical age distribution of suicide before the war. So you can see in most countries in the world, you would typically see fairly low prevalence of suicide in the youngest groups, youngest boys and girls. And then as people age, the risk of suicide increases. You can see typically the highest rate, the highest risk of suicide is in the elderly population. Now, there are two exceptions to this. Rule one, you can see in the top left-hand side is Southeast Asia. And there you can see that there is this very interesting bimodal distribution with a lot of suicides in young women and girls, followed by a very substantial decrease in middle age, and then a predictable increase in older age. The other exception is Eastern Europe in men. You can see that there is a very steep increase in suicide very early in life, followed by essentially no decrease, just a plateau, and then a slight further increase in older age. And Ukraine does follow that interesting distribution especially in males. Overall, of course, Eastern Europe tends to have significantly more suicides than pretty much any other region in the world. quite often Baltic states, Russia could be in the top 10. Now, what about then the mental health system that children, who come from Ukraine experience, and what sort of kinds of things might they expect? Now, it'd be fair to say that the mental health system of services in Ukraine was in transition before the war. And the transition was from big asylums, like the one on the right. It's actually quite a beautiful building in my hometown in Lviv, in the west of Ukraine, built at the end of the 19th century, during the times of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That part of Ukraine was part of that empire at the time, and it still exists and still has a lot of patients there. And then moving, including children, and then moving from something like that on the right to an outpatient community center, like the one you can see on the left. This one in particular is called Kolo Semyi. It's a very well-run community center which provides psychological, psychiatric, and social support for a lot of families, including from outside of Lviv. Now, despite that move, still the vast majority of services in Ukraine were still provided by hospitals, inpatient care. And of course, the funding for this was actually focused primarily on inpatient care still, with community care services being in development. The budget of the mental health system in Ukraine was very limited, perhaps similarly to many other countries, but more extreme than say in the UK. Only 2.5% of the health budget was dedicated to mental health, and of that 2.5%, vast majority actually was going towards hospitals still. Now, patients typically would require to pay for medicines in Ukraine, except for a very small number of medicines that is covered by the state. And the other thing is that in Ukraine, like in many other Eastern European countries, you would expect, so a lot, the salaries of doctors, nurses, and psychologists are very low. And so a lot of the time, these professionals either go into private practice, like specialist psychologists would do that, or the ones who remain in state hospitals would very often take backhand payments from patients. That, I have to say, has been changing before the war, especially in primary care, which following some very substantial reforms instituted by a health secretary called Uliana Suprun, really changed very dramatically, and the system was totally changed into essentially money follows the patient, and the more patients the GP would have, the more income they would generate. That pretty much eliminated most of corruption and backhand payments in primary care, which I cannot say about secondary care, unfortunately, still to this day. The other difference that Ukrainian families would see in the UK is access to care. Access to healthcare in Ukraine is interesting because there is a massive stigma, and a lot of people do not access care when they need. The 75% of people who require services and do not access them, that percentage is higher than in most Western countries. So estimates in America, for example, would be somewhere in the 50% region, whereas in Ukraine, we have about 75%. and the difference, say, from some of the more developed nations and Ukraine, I think are mainly to do with stigma. There is a fear of psychiatry. I think psychology seems to have a significantly better brand, and to seek psychological support is not as stigmatizing and not as fear-provoking as seeking psychiatric help. But the reason for this difference in the perception of psychiatry in particular is that for many years in the Soviet times, psychiatry was used as a tool to repress dissidents, and essentially was part of this repressive apparatus of the Soviet state. One of my very good colleague and mentor, Semyon Gluzman, was a person that actually challenged that in the 60s and ended up in prison himself for a very long time. It's fair to say also that Ukraine is a vast country. It's huge, significantly larger than, say, the UK. And so geography also plays an important role. Accessing services when you live in a remote part of the country is very difficult. There is some wonderful work currently being undertaken by a colleague called Irina Pinchuk in Ukraine, where these mobile teams are being created that do outreach work, especially for the more geographically isolated parts of the country. So in general, when we think about psychiatric mental health services in the West, you would see this sort of pyramid with self-care being at the bottom, informal care, community care, then primary care mental health services, then outpatient and community psychiatric services, and then finally the tip of the iceberg are the inpatient care. In Ukraine, it's very different. So there is a lot of self-care at the bottom, very little community care, and then a lot of care being delivered in these long stay facilities and specialized services. Something that a lot of children and their parents will not be familiar when they come to the UK are waiting lists. So most of you who work in the NHS, or even I have to say in some private services, will know that accessing these services is exceptionally difficult in the UK. The waiting times are incredibly long. And a lot of Ukrainian families will not be familiar with this concept of a waiting time, a waiting list. When I say to them that for an ADHD assessment or an autism assessment, typically one has to wait many, many months, they think it's not possible, that I'm joking, or it's some sort of they misunderstood what I'm saying to them. In fact, I very often ask people who are able to do so to go back to Ukraine for the diagnostic assessment and sometimes for treatment, because access to services in Ukraine is pretty much immediate, whereas in the UK one has to wait for a very long time. The same is true about diagnostic investigations. Again, when people are faced with months and sometimes years wait for a CT scan, that's something that most people don't think is true. In Ukraine, for example, even fairly people of fairly modest means could afford to get a CT scan done pretty much the following day, if needed. Some other differences that children and their families bring to the UK from Ukraine is that physical punishment, unfortunately, is still a lot more prevalent in Ukraine. It is getting better, I have to say, and in the last few years, there was a big push towards a reduction in physical chastisement of children, but it is still the case that it is more common in Ukraine than in the UK. And it's something that I think one needs to be aware when working with the Ukrainian family. I guess one needs to explain to the family that in the UK there is very different legislation and cultural expectations. The other thing that often surprises Ukrainian families is how much supervision British children need to be under. So in Ukraine, it is, children could be left by themselves at a significantly younger age than in the UK. And sometimes our therapists in the UK wonder also about how independent Ukrainian children are in relation to, for example, walking from school to home, or even sometimes, which really horrifies me, I have to say, but I have seen more than once kids who actually are in charge of their own medication, so they're supposed to take their own medicines. So some of these cultural differences and expectations need to be managed. So in terms of interventions, again, unfortunately, in Ukraine, pharmacological treatments are significantly more common than any other evidence-based interventions. And within the pharmacological interventions, some of them could be totally non-evidence-based, very idiosyncratic. However, psychological support is accepted more and more in Ukraine. And I have to say, it seems to me that most families of kids who suffered from the war trauma would be happy to receive at least some support for these trauma manifestations, whereas pharmacological treatment is stigmatized, and most families would not want that for their kids. Yes, we still before the war had these awful places called internats, which are like long stay, very often incredibly poorly staffed and maintained places, and that's one of the things I think we need to change in Ukraine after the war. As a matter of priority, these things need to stop. You will know that a lot of Ukrainians are on the move. Recent estimates would put the number of people displaced from their homes to perhaps 7.5 million people. It's one of the largest movements of people in Europe since the Second World War, perhaps the largest. It is hard to estimate how many people from Ukraine are in the UK. I think good estimates would be somewhere around 300,000, maybe 200 to 300,000. Poland, is one of those countries with significantly more people from Ukraine than that, and the way that Poland welcomed Ukrainians is really unprecedented. When it comes to requesting help from healthcare facilities, including mental health facilities, then you can see that most of the time these requests come from the frontline areas. The closer to the front line, the more need there is. And consequently, also most of the damages in those frontline facilities. Interestingly, most of the damage to healthcare facilities in Ukraine occurred in Kyiv, which is not itself on the front line, but has been targeted by Russian missiles and bombs extensively right from the very beginning of the war, followed by a city called Kharkiv, which is a very large city in the east of the country. And when healthcare facilities get targeted, they get targeted in a very comprehensive and horrifying way. Sometimes these facilities are literally wiped out. There are many of those facilities in Ukraine that used to be used for mental health patients, and some of them are totally wiped out and cannot be repaired. The peak of these attacks on healthcare facilities actually was in March 2022 and has been reducing since then. And the means by which these facilities get damaged are primarily heavy weapons, such as artillery fire and rockets. This is slightly old. This is September. At that time, we had over 100 health providers who tragically died of Russian attacks. That number will be significantly higher now. And the number of kids either killed or significantly affected by life-changing sort of injuries is over 1,000 now in Ukraine. Right at the very beginning of the war, literally maybe the first few days, my wife and I went to the Ukrainian border to deliver some aid. And then we went several times since then. This time we went with a wonderful crew from the BBC, and this is a colleague and a friend of mine, a wonderful photographer, who took us to a place called, who spent some time with Ukrainian refugees in a place called Przemyśl on the Ukrainian border. This little boy is 13, from one of the eastern cities. He looks, you would agree, significantly older than 13. And these two girls are actually his sisters, who look at him as the man of the family. This picture on the left, I took myself, of a girl with her cat. You can see that the cat seems more disturbed than the girl. And the boy on the right, again by Tom, if you look closely, you can see that he's carrying a sock, and there's a rat, his rat in the sock. It's a very sweet picture. A lot of kids are coming or trying to come with their pets. And a lot of thinking has gone into supporting these children. So Rachel and I are part of a large group of people with some experience of trauma work, who are doing a systematic review of digital interventions. We think about how best to scale some of the interventions that we know could work. We should be publishing this review, I hope, soon. WHO has been very helpful. You know, there is this pan-European mental health coalition, which my unit from Queen Mary is part of, started by a wonderful colleague called Stefan Priebe. And one of the first meetings of the coalition was actually dedicated to the war in Ukraine. So what about the UK then? So we have lots of children. Be fair to say that it'll be in tens of thousands. I've heard an estimate of 29,000, it may be more now. Certainly Ukrainian Saturday schools are full of kids. We have a school in Holland Park, which had a few hundred kids before the war, and now there are thousands. And now that school is opening various other Saturday schools around the UK. And this is a wonderful example of our work. We collaborated with a great children's writer called Di Redmond, who wrote a book called The Rucksack. I have a copy actually, interesting, next to me. It's a beautiful book about a girl and a boy from Ukraine who arrive in the UK. And then it's very sort of cleverly crafted piece of work, looking at a number of manifestations of difficulties that kids have when they arrive. And then it comes with a little booklet, which Bill Yule, Katerina Yavna, and myself put together to supplement the book with some exercises on how to overcome some of the more difficult parts of their journey. When we work with children, of course, drawing some of the horrors they experienced is a very central part of the work, we had a great experience of offering art sessions for children from Ukraine in Shepherd's Bush. We had 5 sessions on Saturdays over the summer period. Kids had a wonderful time. We had about between 15 and 25 children every time. This is one of the sessions when they were making their own T-shirts, and you can see a lot of Ukrainian flags on their T-shirts there. The boy on the right is actually from a place called Mariupol, which is one of the more affected parts of Ukraine. And you can see he's done something very clever. His T-shirt is, so he spent a lot of time in the underground, in a bomb shelter, because of the constant bombardment of the city. So these sort of black structures is something that he saw for many weeks in Mariupol. And then you can see that very cleverly in the middle of the T-shirt, he's got this symbol of the London Underground, and it says in Ukrainian, underground. Another session was to do with creating a gold key. So each child got a key, and they were supposed to cover it with gold paint, and then beautifully wrap it into these little parcels. So that little girl, and then we were telling them, look, you know, these keys, they're very special. They're magic. They bring good luck. You could keep them under your pillow. You can give them as a present to people. And then this little girl came to me and said, oh, you know what? My key is already working. And I said, how is it working? She said, well, it's magic. So I just learned that my dad, who was on the front line, is actually coming to join my family in the UK. It was a very sweet moment. A lot of kids, so this is done by, I worked with 2 sisters from Mariupol, I think. And, you know, as part of the work, they were supposed to draw what Mariupol is going to, like, what the future is going to look like for them. And this is Mariupol after the war. You can see very happy people around, and flower beds, and then a lot of shops there with Ukrainian Ukrainian names. For those of you who are working with kids in Ukraine, please remember that we have a number of organizations open for them. Ukrainians typically are a lot more religious than people from Western Europe, and we have a number of churches. There is one in Bond Street in London, which is the one pictured here, in Duke Street. That's a Catholic church. We also have a wonderful, wonderful Orthodox church in Acton in the east. People really quite like coming to these places. We have St. Mary's School in Holland Park, as I said, and a number of other schools now around the UK. We have Scouts for many years now, and I'm also a Scout leader. We had a couple of camps for them during the summer, where we met hundreds of kids from Ukraine, some badly affected, but most seem to be really quite okay to me. And then in that church in Duke Street, there is a free consultation service called Ukrainian Welcome Center, that anybody could come and get support when it comes to at the NHS, benefits, housing, and these kinds of things. And that's it. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, we'd be very happy to answer the questions.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That's so interesting. It's the way that you provide so much information on the context, I think, is really valuable for everybody trying to understand what's happening, and for people working with Ukrainians in the UK. I'm sure that's going to be really, really valuable. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, but I haven't noticed any questions come through. But there's plenty of time, at the end to go for questions. There was something I wanted to ask, though, which is something I was thinking about when I was thinking about the presentation, and that is, you talked about what happens when hostilities are over, and what should mental health, psychosocial support services look like for that stage, and are there things we can be doing now to prepare for that stage?
I would really like to know what you think about this too, Rachel, but I'll say what I think to begin with. So, I mean, my impression from the kids I've seen so far is that, the vast majority of them will be fine. There's no question about that. The resilience of these kids, it's extraordinary. There will be some kids who will be badly affected by this. And to me, it seems that there are two big groups of kids. One group are kids with pre-existing disorders. So we had this charitable clinic in one of those churches, and I've seen a fair number of kids. The ones who struggle the most are the ones with pre-existing anxiety problems, ADHD, autism, some undiagnosed. And these kids really struggle with the trauma of the war, and also the trauma of moving to a different country, especially, as you can imagine, kids with autism. So we do need to think about kids with pre-existing disorders. That's one big group. The other big group are kids who went through really quite unspeakable trauma. That's a small number of kids, but some of their stories are just unbelievably hard to even believe, that a human being could do something like this to a child. And some of these kids are mute. They just don't speak. So, so for that, and I think, and those kids are less familiar to mental health providers in Ukraine. I think we will need to do a lot more training and a lot more education and support for the families of these kids. And a lot of the work that I'm sure you and I are doing is just psychoeducation, explaining the nature of these symptoms that kids have, why they have them. And and that's a big thing. That's not a small thing. Just explaining how common this is, especially in the group. If you have a number of parents or a number of kids, and everybody's sharing their similar stories, that's an incredibly validating thing for most people. However, we do need to train a lot more people in working with this severe side of trauma. Now, how we do this, can be good to know what you think. Obviously, there will not be enough people to deliver this to everybody who needs it. I think digital must play a part. But really would be good to know what you think about that too.
Yeah, I think some of it is stuff that I'm going to be covering.
Okay.
It's very interesting the point you're making about autism, for example, because talking to Ukrainians here in Manchester, they're astonished at the hugely long waiting lists, and the fact that they're saying, well, apparently they would be much more able to get help much sooner in Ukraine. That's been a real help for them.
That is true.
Yeah. And thinking about the children who've been through really unspeakable experiences and who are mute, this is something that my colleague Ala Alkani really noticed when she was in refugee camps on the Turkey-Syria border.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a big international and multi-agency push, I think, to recognise what we do for people who've been through these kinds of experiences. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any questions, so we'll save up for later. And perhaps, thank you very much, Dennis, and we can move on to my slides now.
Yes, all right. Let me try and do this.
Dennis is very kindly sharing slides on my behalf because I've got a rather aged computer. I've bought a new one, but I'm not entirely confident with using it. So I thought it was safest if I adopt the Patrick Vallance approach and say, next, please, every few minutes. Are you able to put it onto the full screen, Dennis?
Yes, let me just...
That's great. Thank you very much. So if we can start going through them. What I'm going to be talking about really are families and children, and how important families are as the front line of defence for children who experience military conflicts and displacement. Next. The numbers are staggering. Dennis was talking about the very large numbers of Ukrainians in the UK and the huge number of Ukrainians who've moved from their own country. All sorts of statistics are thrown around. I saw recent ones, probably a couple of years old, that there are 26 million refugees. I'm sure there are more than that. Over half of them who are children who are in need of help. And we know that children from Ukraine or in Ukraine have been very seriously affected by all the changes that are happening and by the attacks there, to the extent that UNICEF have recently said that all children in Ukraine should be considered as having been affected by war. Primary caregivers can act as an important protective shield, or they can further complicate war stress, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment. And we know that family interaction is predictive of children's adjustment. Next, please. There's a really useful model that was developed by Arakelian and Ager, and they published a paper in 2021 in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. And this is an image from it. It's an update really on Bronfenbrenner's model, with the child nested within the family, who's then influenced by community factors and who are again influenced by institutions and policy factors. And I think it's such a useful model to keep coming back to. And they reviewed this model in relation to the mental health and psychosocial well-being of refugee children. And I think it's a very important model, and their findings are very important. And they look over time, so it's the dynamic model as well. So we know that children are at risk of mental health difficulties. We know that older children, and particularly female children, seem to be at greater risk. And we know that there are lots of protective factors as well. Through this talk, I hope to adopt the relentlessly optimistic approach that's being recommended for working with climate change, because I think it's the same thing really. The whole field of refugee mental health can seem really overwhelming, but actually there are things that we can hang on to which are extremely important for children's mental health. If children have strong ethnic identity and national identity, that's very positive. If they are able to assimilate well into the country that they move to, that's very positive. If they can adopt an optimistic, happy and resilient coping styles, that's very positive. If they're able to use problem-solving approaches, if they're good on social support seeking. And I think looking at the children that Dennis was showing pictures of in the Rucksack Project in London, you could see really how having positive experiences in a friendly and welcoming community can really be very beneficial. Having religion is positive and strong values. And there are many other aspects as well. I'm going to be talking particularly about children and families, but there are social factors in relation to, for example, schools, when we look at the community level, And at the institutional levels, the interaction with the, if you like, the state is really important as well in determining how people get along. If refugees are struggling to get their right to stay established, this can have a really devastating effect on their family interactions, on children's, older children's adjustment. So these are all very important factors to bear in mind. Next one, please. So what are the common reactions that are seen in children? Emotional distress, being fearful, anxious and sad. These were things that would be very familiar to anybody who's worked with children who have been through conflict and displacement. Behaviour changes, becoming shy and withdrawn or active and aggressive. They may show somatic symptoms. They may show trauma-specific reactions to stress with nightmares, difficulty sleeping. They may show an increase in more childlike behaviours like clinging and bedwetting and thumb sucking. They may show difficulties concentrating. And there are also specific signs of post-traumatic stress that they may show as well. Next, please. How does military conflict and displacement affect parenting? This has been an area where there's been a huge increase in the last decade. And it's very interesting that Areklyan and Aja in their review noted that parenting is actually an extremely important factor for children's mental health. Parents, we know from thinking kind of the process that families go through when flight or attack is threatened, through to the displacement and then resettlement. When parents are living under threat, they tend to increase their warmth and overprotection of children. So they really up protective factors, which is really valuable. However, when they're faced with the stress of conflict and flight, it doesn't necessarily, but it can diminish caregivers' warmth and increase harsh and coercive parenting practices. So knowing something about the culture and, for example, whether physical chastisement of children is already part of the culture is a really valuable thing to know. And we know also that caregivers' own trauma histories and post-migration difficulties are associated with greater levels of PTSD in caregivers, and that in turn is associated with more harsh parenting. So as conflict and displacement set in, you can see the risk factors starting to stack for children. If we move on. It's really important to be optimistic and to be very aware that parenting and caregiver practice can really improve significantly. Children's adjustment can improve significantly, and that trauma-informed programming is really showing all sorts of promise. I love this photo that was actually taken from a newspaper, which shows two very cheerful little children having a bath in what looks like the most devastating of circumstances. And I think it's just a nice illustration that even in the most dreadful circumstances, a caregiver who's able to create fun and enjoyment can have a really important effect for children. Next. What I'm going to talk about predominantly is work that's been done by myself and by my very important colleague, Dr. Ala Elkani, who came to do a PhD with me in 2010. Very soon after she started her PhD on parenting in Arab families, the conflict in Syria began. And she's from a family with Syrian heritage, and very rapidly their home filled up with relatives who were seeking sanctuary from Syria and who were watching the news reports in absolute horror. And Ala and I began to have conversations about what it must be like to be a parent in a war zone. Now, at that time, there was very little literature on that topic, and Ala decided to refocus her PhD onto families living through the Syrian conflict. And she went to Turkey and worked with families who had escaped from the conflicts in Syria. And she was on the Turkey-Syria border, interviewing parents about their experiences of being a parent living through conflict and displacement. And she did a series of interviews and focus groups with with family members and with professionals, and she wrote 3 papers on the basis of that. And my slides are going to be circulated, so you'll be able to follow through on this literature. What she found, if you can go to the next slide, please, was a whole range of different challenges, not necessarily surprising, but important to think about when we think how to help. Parents were, predominantly mothers, were talking about their living conditions and stresses, and how they felt the need to keep their children very close to them. I don't like them far. How do I know what they're doing? Everything is new here. How can I balance giving them freedom I know they need with keeping them safe? It's very hard. And they talked about the barriers to accessing support, the lack of support, as well as the lack of basic essential needs, shelter and food and warmth and so on. Next, please. They also talked about some very specific challenges they experienced with their children. They noticed really marked changes in behaviour, and they talked about what they saw as completely new behavioural difficulties. They're spitting and hitting and shouting and using bad words. Sometimes I can't believe these are my children. We all say this, they're very bad now. And they talked about the emotional challenges as well. They cry at night, they scream a lot while they're sleeping, they're very angry, they have so many unanswered questions I don't know how to answer. Next one. And their experience of being a parent as well. They talked very much about a loss of control. I cannot control anything around me. We're living each second unaware of what's coming next. You ask me what it's like to be a mum now. Well, this is it. It's like we're not mums. We're just keeping kids alive by feeding them and making sure they're alive and safe. And they talked about their own emotional challenges. I shouted to him, enough, come on, you must stop looking sad. I know before you say, that's all wrong. What else can I do? So you can see that the anger and the frustration that they were experiencing was influencing the way they were talking with their children. Next. Cutting kind of to the end of the story, what Alla and I did was to work on a series of studies where we looked to developing a pyramid. It has developed into a pyramid of approaches, and we worked on this in later years with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, who are very, very interested in promoting positive mental health in children as a preventive strategy. And so I'm going to talk about a number of programs that we've developed in the course of that joint work. And the first of these was leaflets providing basic information. Dennis was talking about the importance and value of psychoeducation, and that's what I'm going to talk about first. Next. What the parents had told Alla as she interviewed them in those camps was about the difficulties they were having. And so we set to work to write a leaflet, which could be on 2 sides of A4, which could be very easily shared, and which would give the absolute basic information that parents needed when they were living through this crisis of escape and conflict. And so we wrote, one side of it is about you as a parent, so or caregiver. What might you be experiencing? What can you do to help yourself? So some basic points being recognizing the challenges that you're facing, allowing yourself to mourn, because they were all talking about the experience of grief and loss, trying to be patient, seeking social support, and trying to maintain routines as much as possible. So that was for the parents. And then on the next slide, about your child, what might your child be experiencing? So trying to explain the child's perspective and what they were going through, what parents could do to help their child. So by providing basic safety, warmth and support, giving praise. And here we use the parenting literature very much on ways of giving praise that really help to shape children's behaviour in the ways that parents are wanting to see. Spending time together and talking, encouraging play and maintaining a routine. So through these leaflets, we merged together what the parents had been telling us with the literature. And then we went through a process with refugees in Manchester who looked at the leaflet, gave us feedback, and we refined it. And then we had it translated into Arabic. And then the next stage was to distribute it. Next, please. And this led to what we called the bread wrapper study. When Allah had been in the camps on the Turkey-Syria border, one of the humanitarian workers there had said, I know how you can get information out to families. You could put, we're sending out bread every day to families. You could put information in with the bread that families were given. And he explained that they were transferring bakery supplies from Turkey into Syria, and Syrian bakeries were producing loaves of bread, and they were sure that they could use this as a research vehicle. Next, please. And so we went along with their approach. We put a questionnaire in with the leaflets, and they were delivering bread to families living in Syria. And they had lists of families who included internally displaced people and families who were already living in these particular areas, conflict areas. To our absolute astonishment, they were able to share 3,000 leaflets through the bags in 2 days as part of their routine deliveries. Now, this is in a context where one of the bakeries they were planning to use was bombed, so they had to relocate to another bakery. So it's really, really impressive. And they put boxes out at the bakeries so that when families came to collect their next loaf of bread, they could drop off their questionnaire. And the families received the leaflet and questionnaire and a pen. We were astonished to find that within 5 days, nearly 60% of families had returned questionnaires. So this was a very high return rate on the questionnaires, and their ratings on the information was really, really positive. Next, please. So the further right you go on the chart, the higher the usefulness rating. So you can see the vast majority of respondents found the leaflet quite a lot useful or a great deal. So they were really showing the usefulness of the leaflet. Next, please. And there was a space on the questionnaire for parents to write comments, and we were just so moved to read these. We had a worry that people would say, well, this is far too simplistic. You know, what are you doing? Why insulting us with this sort of stuff when we're struggling to find something to eat and somewhere to sleep? But they wrote such tender, such kind comments. May God reward you for your efforts. I'm a widow. The children dream of him and cry, and I don't know how to calm the fire inside them when I'm feeling this boiling inside myself. I feel like I'm not alone in feeling like this now, and there are others like me. Thank you. And so, and a second comment saying, I found it helpful to understand my children are not alone feeling like this, and neither am I. And then talking about grief and loss, but saying your efforts are greatly appreciated. And one of the things that they said to us really clearly was that they wanted more detailed information. So even though they were living in these very, hand-to-mouth complex environments, they were very keen to have more information. Next, please. Oh, just to show, this is a photo that the humanitarian agency sent us of a child filling in the questionnaire on the mother's behalf. I was really struck by this. We're so used to a kind of European model of, or UK determined model of extreme confidentiality when filling in questionnaires. We have permission to run things this way, but this was very much a family effort filling in the questionnaire. Next, please. And we shared, Ala Al-Kani gave a talk on TEDx, which became a TED talk, what it's like to be a parent in a war zone. And she's had well over 1 million views of this, and it's translated into at least 22 languages. So this is something that has been very widely shared, which is great to know. So it's a very interesting talk if you're interested. And the resources, the leaflet has been picked up by, for example, the Welsh Traumatic Stress Wales, and by the Royal College of Psychiatrists as well. Next. We've also had the leaflet with Dennis's help. Singer, songwriter and blogger Irina Karpa, a Ukrainian, has recorded the leaflet, and we've now done this in a few languages. And what it means that people can listen to the leaflet, and if you won't be able to, well, I'm not going to do it now, but you'll see if you follow the link on the talk later on, that you get the voice speaking the leaflet and the words popping up. So it means that people can just hear and see the information and reflect on it. Next. We joined forces with, as I say, with UNODC, who've also linked up with the University of Oxford and their Parenting for Lifelong Health initiative. And UNODC now estimate that resources like the leaflet and ones that Oxford came up with as well, which are, you can see in the middle of the picture, are kind of very brightly coloured little tiles. These have been handed out to 11.5 million families, they estimate. So it's possible to get very, very good reach by working in partnership. Next. At the next level up, I was saying that parents said they wanted more information, and the next level up is booklets and a conversation group. Next, please. So we wrote a much more detailed booklet that's quite a few pages that people can just download, or they can just read it online. And we also wrote a script for a little conversation group so that people who are non-experts can sit down together and share the information in the booklet. And this is written, we've tried to write it in a very positive way so that we've tried to reduce as much as possible the risk that people start sharing their experiences of trauma and instead focus on how to use positive approaches to care for children through conflict and displacement. And we use a lot of the parenting literature, the evidence base on how to help parents care for children through these contexts and conflicts. And Ala Al-Kani and colleagues did a study on the West Bank and were able to publish that in the Journal of International Psychology. And it showed that parents found the information helpful. They liked the format. So it's clearly a feasible sort of approach. And it's open access, so anybody can download it. And it is available in the Ukrainian translation as well. Next. At the next level up, we worked with UNODC on the Strong Families programme. And the aim of Strong Families is to have a way of helping families improve their communication with each other. So one of the things that comes out in the reviews very strongly is that family support and communication within the family can be a very important protective factor. Next, please. So we worked on this very light touch programme for caregivers of children aged 8 to 15, which aims to improve parenting skills, child well-being and family mental health as well. What's important about this is it's been designed for humanitarian and challenge settings. So it's to be used, possible to use it for non-specialists to use it. Next, please. And it's aimed for families who are under stress. It's a universal programme, but where families are under stress. It's very brief and evidence informed. It's suitable for low resource settings. And what I would say about the UK at the moment is that mental health services are a pretty low resource setting. And this would be quite appropriate to use in communities in the UK. It's open source, so all that facilitators need is some training. And there's a caregiver pre-session for the first week. And then after that, there's a caregiver session and a child session in parallel. And then a family session together. It's been used in over 20 countries so far. There's a number of publications on this with Ala Al-Kani as the lead author on a lot of them. We did the initial work in Afghanistan. So it's really useful for Afghan refugees as well, if anybody's working with Afghan refugees in the UK. Next, please. And there's been some comparative data, so a couple of studies, one in Afghanistan and one in Serbia. And what we've found is that it seems to be particularly helpful. It seems that families like it and they find it helpful. It seems to be particularly helpful in families where there are children who are showing very high levels of difficulty on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. And there were two separate studies run. And for children who are showing these sorts of difficulties, you can see the improvements in their scores over time. So 2 weeks after Strong Families, and then again 6 weeks after Strong Families, which with their scores moving down into the average range. So that's really positive change for children. We don't have randomized controlled trials. The context that these families have been living in haven't been conducive to full-on randomized controlled trials, but these sorts of data do seem very positive. Next, please. It's been run, as I say, in many different countries. And what always happens in every country that we go into is that there's the pilot process where trainers are trained, where we go through all the materials and see whether they're suitable for their particular context. And then the program goes through a process of adaptation. And what we've tended to find pretty much everywhere is all that needs to happen is that the images in the program need to change. Next, please. So we have very basic images of, for example, here's a woman doing some deep breathing relaxation exercise. We had some little stick figures, but one particular country wanted to have these kinds of more human-looking images. And so you'll see that the manuals look different across different languages, but actually the information is the same. Next, please. At the next level up is the TRT Plus Parenting Programme and collaboration that we've done on that. And this has been a really valuable collaboration that we had with Patrick Smith, Bill Ewell, and the Children of War Foundation. Next, please. So TRT is probably familiar to lots of you as a programme which is designed for helping children with recovery from post-traumatic stress. And children, it's not a universal programme, it's a programme for children who are showing elevated levels of stress. And the original programme is made up of 5 sessions for children, group sessions, and 2 parent sessions, group parent sessions. And what we did jointly with the Children of War Foundation was to develop an enhanced parenting set of parenting sessions, so that TRT Plus Parenting now includes 5 children's sessions and 5 parent sessions. And what we've done to enhance the sessions for parents is to add in effect, the information from the conversation groups and from the Strong Families programme. So these are all evidence-based parenting skills that we've drawn from reviews of the literature and from really top quality research, and also from the research on experiences of parents who've lived through conflict and displacement. Next, please. And what we did first of all was to pilot this with Syrian families who were living in Turkey. They were living on the Turkish border, and these were families who had fairly recently escaped from Syria. Here's the children and their parents getting their certificates. The programme went down very well. So this was a feasibility study. It was very popular with the families, and it also seemed to be producing good results. So we then moved from this onto the next study, which was a trial of teaching recovery techniques plus parenting. And this was with 120 Syrian refugee families in Lebanon. The study was facilitated by UNODC. And what they wanted to know was really whether it's worth doing plus parenting. They were absolutely sold on TRT because the research on it is already very good. There have been studies in all sorts of different countries and with different populations. And what UNODC wanted to know was, does the plus parenting component actually add anything? So in this area of Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, there were lots of teachers who were already trained in TRT, and they were running it in schools with their refugee families. And so we trained remotely. We trained these teachers remotely on the plus parenting components, and they ran a trial where there was a waiting list, families on waiting list, children who just did TRT, and children whose families did the plus parenting component as well. So they had TRT plus parenting. And what we found was that both TRT and TRT plus parenting showed significant improvements in traumatic stress measures. But what it also showed was that both children and caregivers saw improvement, enhanced improvement in the plus parenting integrated programme. And this is written up, it was published in 2021. If we look at the next slide, we can see an example. So here's an example from the CRIES measure, which is the Children's Revised Impact of Events Scale. This is the intrusion scale. And what you can see is that the waitlists show not much improvement. Children who just have the TRT programme show significant improvement, but there was a significantly higher level of improvement for children in the TRT plus parenting condition. And we saw this on all three scales of the CRIES, so across intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. We saw the same pattern in children's self-rated anxiety and depression. Always the greatest improvements were in the TRT plus parenting group. On parenting measures, parents reported significantly lower parenting scale scores, particularly over reactivity. So they were finding it easier to manage their children, themselves in relation to their children. It helped parents feel significantly less depressed and anxious and stressed. And what was also really striking was that the parents' impact of event scale scores showed the most rapid improvement if they have the plus parenting condition. So that suggests to us that enhancing parenting skills has value. And this is something that can be achieved even in challenged contexts. Of course, we need to do more trials of this. We need to see how this would work for children who are perhaps in the UK. We need to see how it works in different countries and with different populations. But we were really very encouraged by these results. Next. Very sadly, we know that conflict and flight displacement isn't going away. And I think what we need to really think about is how we build communities that have the knowledge and strengths to cope with the potential for war, for military conflict and displacement. So we need to think about before, we need to think about during, when families are in flight, and we need to think about afterwards. So before, we know from the literature now that families are particularly warm and overprotective when they feel under threat. That's something that we could really be capitalising on by providing information, because people will be hungry for information on that stage about how best to cope. We know, we've seen from the work with the psychoeducation materials that we've shared, that during conflict and displacement, parents are receptive to information, even if they're living with very difficult circumstances or on the road. And of course, once families move into resettlement, they have a whole new set of questions about the sort of help, the best help that they need. And we need to have a really nuanced way of thinking about people through different stages of this journey and what's going to be helpful. And then afterwards, that's, of course, I was asking Dennis questions about this, because families are going to be in very different circumstances depending on the sorts of conflict that they've been fleeing from. So in Ukraine, the hope is that families will be reunited back into Ukraine. Fathers will have been at war. For other countries, for example, if we think about Afghan refugees, there's been an influx recently of Afghans where the fathers have perhaps come first. They've been able to access the UK through the scheme following the takeover by the Taliban. And then it's the mothers and children who are following on. So what's happened after the major displacement is different. The implications of families are different. And what it means is that we need to be able to think about all of those stages in a really kind of multi-agency way, a very joined up way, and hopefully come up with models that will help people at each of those stages. And it's by working together that we're going to have the greatest impact. Next, please. So here's the model that I showed at the beginning. And this is the sort of level that we're going to have to be thinking about when we think about how to help people at different stages along the journey in time. And thinking particularly about Ukraine, I think there's another effect that we need to take into account. Next, please. I don't know how many of you will recognize this face. A very, very, perhaps one of the best known faces in the world now. Next. And a book came out end of November, early December, called The Zelensky Effect, written by Olga Onuk, who's at University of Manchester, and her colleague Hale, whose first name I've forgotten. This is a really, really interesting book if you're interested in the Ukraine invasion, because what they'd been doing is tracking research on their lectures in politics, and they've been tracking the political situation in Ukraine for many years. And so they were able to track what happened with Zelensky's popularity. The reason I think it's such an interesting thing for psychologists to think about and mental health workers is that, unlike many, many other conflicts, what Zelensky is doing is providing a really, really strong model of unity. He's shown a tremendous increase in popularity post-invasion. And what he's really done is help Ukrainians to rally around the flag. I've put these headings. These are points that have come out of their analyses of huge amounts of data on Ukraine and the Ukrainians pre and post invasion. There's a real factor of rallying around the flag. He's been able to facilitate a mass mobilization of Ukrainians as well. So Ukrainians will say that they're doing what they can to aid the nation's survival. And that's been really clear from the information that we've seen here. He's been very powerful in rallying international opinion. And he's shown really, he's modelled very, very strongly the importance of civic attachment to the state, and with clear, explicit values, which are very, very positive. And I think that this kind of level of leadership has really important implications for mental health. So this is different to the experience of other armed conflicts and displacements, where displaced people will have a very different relationship with the leaders of their country of origin. For example, the Taliban. Zelensky is such a master of communications because of his history in media, that he's able to communicate very, very well, very rapidly and very effectively with the population wherever they are. So, and the Ukrainian state has been really powerful in reaching out, providing education for children wherever they are in the world, and providing a real sense of home. Ukraine as a home, as an entity, and as a welcome waiting back as soon as people can go back there to rebuild the country. Again, in complete contrast to many other countries where we have seen an exodus, huge exodus of people. And I think this provides a really important research opportunity. I know we always say more research is needed, but I think it's really important to include that outer circle of that model and think about the relevance for people's mental health, because my guess is that it will provide a very, very positive effect. There's a further Zelensky effect, of course, which is his wife, Alina Zelenska, who has been contributing to psychological thinking and helping to coordinate responses. And she said something very interesting in an interview in June in the Irish Times. Nobody needs a country that has won, that has fought for its territory, but that is populated by people who can't live, function, or bring up their children normally. There are big dangers ahead of us. So she is anticipating that need in the future to really think about all the levels of need for people returning to Ukraine and for the people of Ukraine. And I think it provides a really important challenge for mental health and psychosocial support. Next. So we know there are all sorts of practical considerations when we evaluate resources and programs. I've talked particularly about ones that I've been involved in developing. The group that Dennis and I have been working on has been looking particularly at digital resources, but there are lots of other resources available as well. And it's really important we think about things like the age of children and how settled they are, how long they've been where they're living, thinking about the interventions that are available and where they've been developed and the theories of change that they use, the evidence base for interventions. There are tons of interventions out there, but the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard, and it's really important to adhere to that, try and aim for that. To think about the feasibility of interventions, there are huge numbers of very lengthy interventions that we know work, but they're just not going to be feasible because they're too long. We need to think about training requirements, who needs to be trained and how, and infrastructure. Next. And I wanted really to close by talking about something much more personal, which I think is really important for everybody who works in this area. And I keep talking about optimism. This is my mother, a photograph taken almost 100 years ago in China, where she was born. She, as a child, had to flee military conflict in just the clothes she was standing up in. Now, this, to me, this was just the normal part of my family story. I took it just, you know, that was the story I'd tell about my mother if anybody asked where I was from. She returned to her family in Yorkshire. They had a long and difficult journey back to UK. They went back to live with the family in Yorkshire, and my grandmother established a little school where my mother grew up, you know, had a very happy home. But my mother talked about going to school when she got back to Yorkshire, having grown up in China, having had the first 6 years of her life in China, and how she was different, and how this clearly made her a source of some very unwanted attention. And she very quickly dropped anything Chinese from her character and her speech and just tried to fit in with the other children in Yorkshire. And I never really thought about it very much until I started working in the refugee and humanitarian field. And I was very struck talking to other people, for example, at UNODC, how many of them have really dreadful experiences in their history of witnessing appalling violence of the very worst kind. And I think it's very easy to think that this is something that can make people, you know, that can harm people. We have this idea, if you bring up children in a war zone, you create warriors. But what you can create is people who are very compassionate, who are very dedicated to making the world a better place for other people, and who really show enormous resilience and commitment. So I think it's really important to hang on to those sorts of thoughts as well, and not to feel worn down by working in this kind of field. No. So to summarise what I was wanting to say, really, there's a real need for family skills training and support for children and families who live through conflict and multiple challenges. It's really important that we look at good adaptations and theory-driven evidence-based programs, that we really appreciate the context that families have lived through and think about their particular needs, think about the countries they've come from, the context they've come from, and to be really aware of the power of kindness and compassion in changing people's lives. And my last slide is really just to show that the resources are available on the link there. And I just want to thank everybody that I've worked with on all these really, really interesting studies. So what we'd like to do now is just to flip into any questions that people may have, any things that wanting to ask about in the last minutes that we have. Dennis, have you picked up any questions as we've been going through?
I don't think there were any questions. Whilst if there are some questions, I'll. Are you using interpreters for the parent group? Has there been any difficulties with the language barrier, possible misinterpretation? If so, how did you overcome this?
That's a really good question, yes. So for strong families and for TRT plus parenting, what we did was we trained local facilitators. So we've had to use translators when we've done the training, and sometimes we've trained multiple languages at the same time, which becomes an absolute mayhem. but it then means that people are working with facilitators who are working in their own languages. As far as have the misinterpretations go, what we've tried to do is to work very closely with, well, sometimes we've used multilingual people to do the training. So they've then been able to watch people delivering the programme, and they're then able to pick up if there's been any misconceptions or people are changing the nature of the programme. So I think it depends very much on the context, but what you bring up is an extremely important point, because if you want fidelity to the programme, you really need to make sure that you've got some means of tracking through what people are doing when they deliver. So it means working with people who can use those different languages. For Arabic, for example, working with Ala Khani, she's bilingual, so she's been able to listen to recordings of what people are doing for their study in Lebanon. And we're able to do similar things with people who we've trained in different countries on the Strong Families programme.
I don't think there are any more questions. There are messages of gratitude, I think, mainly. Yes, I suppose, yeah, this mainly just people saying thank
you. we are circulating the slides and so on, so do please get in touch if there's things you want to ask about, if there's things that we can help with. And thank you very much for attending, and I hope you found it useful and helpful. Thanks very much, everybody.
Likewise, thank you from me too. And if there are any questions, it's very easy to find us. We'd be delighted to collaborate.
A very interesting comment just come in. Always had all this experience in Afghanistan. Yeah. We'd love to be helpful to Afghan families. We have materials, we have programs, we have lots available. So do please be in touch. Yeah. Thanks very much.
All the best. Have a good evening. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Rachel and Dennis.
Bye.
Bye.